So despite it having been quite a busy month for me, not really being able to make so many videos, I have somehow, despite all that, managed to actually keep up pretty well with my TBR that I made at the start of this month for the Italian read. So where I am now, I'm currently reading the final book of the 6 books that I set myself. So I think that's been going really well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a review video here for 2 of the books. And then I'm going to do a wrap-up video of all of the books at the end. Today I'm going to be doing 2 reviews, and for me it's almost a bit ironic that these 2 books were amongst the first few books that I read in April. As you may have remembered, in March I said what I was planning on reading were 3 books that were kind of in conversation with each other, and I kept on talking about this sort of like writing as a craft and books as almost conversation pieces amongst a greater literary setting. And it's quite ironic because whilst I didn't really talk about that so much last month, these 2 books were almost as if they were like explicit in their conversations with other literature. So I'll talk about that a bit more as I discuss these books, but the first book I want to review is The Castle of Cross Destinies by Italo Calvino. Now this book is really hard to kind of like summarise, but to contextualise it a little bit, what it is that Italo Calvino was playing around with the concept of tarot cards, and he was laying these tarot cards out in particular ways to see if he could make stories from them. And as he was creating these sort of stories based on these tarot cards, he kind of noticed that he could also retell some stories using them, and he laid them out in specific ways that kind of linked them all together. So basically what this story is a really weird trip down what literature can be and what storytelling is, and how we can tell stories and how we kind of ascribe stories to so many different things. It's a group of people that are kind of met in this castle/tavern. It's kind of not really clear what it is, because it could be both, it could be neither. And in both settings, the stories that are being told are completely different in how they're being told and how people are like grasping to tell their stories. So this group of people are trying to tell a story, and it's all about a story of how they almost like got to the place that they're telling this story from. And in order to do so, because they do not in this space have the faculty of language, none of them do, they're relying on a pack of tarot cards in order to tell their story. So our narrator is almost narrating everybody else's story to us through what he perceives from their choice of tarot cards. And as each character tells their story, in the margins of the story we also get to see the tarot cards that they're being played. So in a way we could almost redetermine or prescribe a different meaning to their story. So that in itself is really interesting, because you're getting almost this a completely different experience to what you're used to reading most novels and things, and it was completely fascinating. But also each story kind of picked up where the last story left off, because perhaps the first person who was telling a story might end on one particular tarot card, but that particular tarot card is the tarot card that the next person begins their story with, and even though their story is completely different, it's really difficult to explain. However, as they play the tarot cards to tell their stories, the tarot cards are laid out on a table. I can actually find an example of this. So you can see here, I will probably insert if it's not very clear, you can see here like a picture of what the table looks like after everyone's told their stories and everyone's played the tarot cards. So you can see how all the stories start in different directions and go in different ways, but they all link together to make this one sort of pattern. And this is almost like almost an activity that Italo Calvino did himself with the tarot cards, to see how these stories could be interwoven and see how he could make stories from a pack of cards laid out in a particular way. In the second half of this book, I guess this is the part that's set in the tavern, stories are being told in a different way, but we're getting stories that we are actually familiar with. And this is what I mean by how this book is a conversation with a greater literary body. We're getting stories of like Hamlet, of King Arthur, of Oedipus, some other ones, like some well-known stories. Calvino is telling those through the tarot cards and through these characters telling their stories, so it kind of blurs the boundaries as to who is telling us a story. Is it Hamlet himself, or is it somebody recounting the story of Hamlet? And how are these stories almost appropriated through an activity like using tarot cards? And then the narrator, who seems very much Calvino's own voice, starts then sort of talking about how his role as a writer and his role of telling the stories of others is almost like impacted by this memory of other people's stories and this almost sacred responsibility you have as a writer to tell stories, and understanding the way that stories can so easily be appropriated. It's got this like sort of massive introspection towards the end about what it means to tell stories and what sort of role the writer or the storyteller has in telling stories, and it just kind of blew me away. I very much understand that this book is more like an experience as opposed to like an enjoyment of reading a story, and I think to many it can be very frustrating, and you might not really feel you're getting anything of it. Were it not for the sort of the playfulness with the whole tarot cards and that whole context behind it, I don't think the story itself or the stories themselves would really hold up. They probably would collapse and be very uninteresting. But I think for me, because of the way it was structured, the way it was told, and the ideas and the concepts behind it, that we were understanding, or the understanding of was growing within us towards the end, that's what made it for me a 5-star read. And I think as an experience itself, a lot of people could get a lot from this, and it's a very interesting one to be had. So it's just kind of, it really defies description, this book, but in a really good way. So the next book that I want to talk about was Pereira Maintains by Antonio Tabucchi. Maintains, not mountains. This book, how to describe this one also? This book is just simply about one very bland man who is writing for the culture column in Portugal, for this newspaper in Portugal, and he, as the story progresses, he is becoming more aware of the politics that are happening in Spain at the time and the way that they're impacting Portugal, and like this sort of dictatorship of the lands and the way that they're impacting the citizens, and how this man's writing becomes a little bit more censored and things. He becomes more aware of these through the introduction of another character who wants to work for the newspaper, and the two of them form like a sort of relationship that helps to almost liberate Pereira from his mundane life. I really did enjoy this. I think one of the most key things is the way the story is told. The reason it's called Pereira Maintains is because throughout the entire text we're being told that Pereira maintains this story that he's telling. So it will have a sentence and it will be like, Pereira maintains, he maintains that this happened. So in a way, the voice that we're being told this story is a really interesting one. It doesn't really click at the start, but actually the tense and the fact that we're getting this whole Pereira maintains denotes that this story is being told almost as if it is like a proceeding from a court case in which Pereira must have done something, that he has told his story and he maintains his story. He is sticking to his guns and he is saying that this is how the story is. So because of that, the story that we are being told is almost cast in doubt, and we're made to doubt some things, particularly when it does use this whole, well, this is what Pereira maintains, because that's what he maintains, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what happened. So that voice of this text really lifts the story from the page and really kind of gets you from the go wondering, well, what's going to happen? What's happening here? As the story progresses, it was fascinating because there's so much symbolism in here. But in this book, Tabucchi doesn't hold symbolism as something sacred. You know how sometimes in texts symbols are very overt, they don't really seem to fit into the story themselves. They're something that is sacred, that is an image outside of the events that's happening to represent something else or something that's happening in the side story. Whereas here, the symbolism is very mundane, it's very everyday, it's very boring and bland to the point where you can almost miss it. Like the symbolism of him, of the omelette in this story, like the main character loves omelettes and he will only eat omelettes, and there are some characters throughout the story progressing who, in concern for his health, wants him to stop eating the omelettes because he needs to have something a bit healthier. He needs to start eating fish or salad, whatnot. So it's like that's just an everyday thing, but then you kind of realise what that actually could mean and what is really happening underlying this imagery of the omelette. Which sounds bizarre, but it makes total sense in this book. So that kind of side of it leaves this level of tension under a book which could just be so everyday and so basic, and really enhances the story that's being told, because you're getting this emotion which you kind of feel stirring within you without actually ever being told that that's what's happening. So for the most part, everything in this book is an undercurrent mood, and then it doesn't really ever get revealed, even at the end, where things become a little bit more clearer as to what's going on. You're still left in this really vague area of what actually happened, particularly as you are being told constantly, this is what Pereira maintains. So for me, that was just a really fascinating way of telling the story. I would have preferred something a bit more. I couldn't give it 5 stars because it was just missing something. I would never be able to point out what it was missing, but there was something which could have just given it just that little bit extra to have made it like almost the perfect text. The reason I wanted to include this in regards to the whole conversation of greater literary works is the fact that in the introduction, Mohsin Hamid talks about the effect that this text had on his own writing. And after Mohsin Hamid read this book, he then went on to write The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And having read The Reluctant Fundamentalist and not enjoying it, I didn't think it was that good a book. But having read that and having read his introduction in this book and learning how he was inspired by this text and then going on to read this book, it's so clear how that inspiration was utilised, and how the voice in The Reluctant Fundamentalist is clearly inspired by this to evoke something tense and evoke that something uncanny is going on without ever really telling it, and to put the reader in a position of doubt as to everything they're being told. So that was really, really interesting to get that perspective, which I wouldn't have had I not read Hamid's introduction to this book. But also, this book, for me personally, really struck a chord with My Tender Matador by Pedro Lemebel. Now, that book I really loved. These two books together make a sort of harmony, which really allows you to see how, even if these authors weren't ever exposed to or aware of each other's texts, that a political background can really shape a story in a particular way. In My Tender Matador, the main character, an older drag queen, is cast into this political sphere through a younger character. And that's almost what happens in this book. Quite, like, in a way, identically, the plots follow very similar things. And whilst My Tender Matador is a lot more explicitly gay, this book does have some sort of homoerotic undertones to it, which I don't know whether it's just my bias as to reading it or whether they are actually there. But you can definitely read that homoerotic sense to it. And again, that just struck a chord with me as to having a similarity with My Tender Matador. And it just made me think how these two books can be so closely related whilst also being so different and within themselves. And again, harking back to the way that Hamid was inspired by this book, it's really interesting to consider how books can talk to each other, and how writers and writing is something that is open to all, which leads to something like The Castle Across Destinies by Calvino, which talks almost about this role as a writer and the role of stories, retelling stories, and the appropriation of stories, but also the harmony of stories together, and how all stories are linked, and how we as storytellers are constantly recycling the ideas, the concepts of a shared human history. So I really enjoyed these two books. They were probably the top books of the month so far that I've read, of this like Italian literature, and I would probably recommend this one to a lot more people, because I understand that this one could be a lot more trickier or a lot more frustrating, but as experiences of understanding different forms of writing and different forms of being made aware of something as a reader, these books can give you food for thought. So that's the sort of reviews for those two books for this video. Hopefully I'll have another video up very soon. I'm pretty sure it should be very soon. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.